On the one hand, you have North Korea's multiple missile tests. Then you have the tensions due to the U.S. provocations in the East China Sea, which has angered China, along with the deployment of the THAAD missile system, which makes for a tense situation in the region, even angering Russia. And just days ago, China announced an increase in its military budget, which has led to speculations of an arms race. The Korea Peninsula tensions, the subject of this edition of the debate.
News agency.
More tension is looming large on the Korean Peninsula. China warns of a potential catastrophic collision in the region a day after the US starts to deploy its controversial missile system in South Korea. The deployment of the first components of the THAAD system came after North Korea fired 4 ballistic missiles on Monday. Beijing has called on Pyongyang to suspend its nuclear and missile programs in exchange for Washington halting its provocative measures in the region. China has warned of a looming crisis, saying North Korea and the United States are set for a head-on collision, with neither side willing to give up. China's top diplomats say South Korea must cease the deployment of US THAAD missile system, saying it undermines China's security. Washington has sought to reassure Beijing over the deployment of the system. It says it's aimed at protecting South Korea and US troops. Beijing and Moscow say the expanded radar system that goes with THAAD can deeply penetrate their territories and be used to spy on their activities rather than monitoring North Korean missiles, which Pyongyang says are part of its defense policy to counter US threats and sanctions. The deployment of THAAD has already caused massive public protests in South Korea. This, besides the protests in Japan against the American forces based in the country. The rising tension comes amid the annual US-South Korea war games, which have angered North Korea.
Every time the US and South Korea spend tens of millions of dollars in mock invasions of North Korea, and then when North Korea reacts, the news likes to start the story in the middle and act like North Korea is being belligerent without pointing out the exercises conducted by the United States and South Koreans. And they need more economic trade and stability, and we really have to be tackling the sanctions, because sanctions only lead to war. When you're not talking with people and you're not trading with people, there's nothing to lose. And these weapons industries and lobbies are making so much money off these war game exercises and belligerency.
Washington's provocative measures in East Asia seem to know no bounds. It is also conducting Navy patrols in the South China Sea. Beijing claims sovereignty over most of the sea and accuses Washington of militarizing the area. The Chinese foreign minister will meet his US counterpart, Rex Tillerson, in China later this month. Tillerson will be the second senior member of the Trump administration to tour East Asia since Trump assumed office less than 2 months ago. Secretary of Defense James Mattis visited Japan and South Korea last month. Now China's hope of brokering a potential deal between North Korea and the US to defuse a looming mess hinges on the new administration's broader engagement with East Asian countries and an end to its provocative policies in the region.
Our guest joining us for this edition of the debate, we have Lawrence Korb. He's the U.S. Foreign Policy and National Security Analyst who joins us from Washington. We also have Jason Unruhe, independent media personality and political commentator who joins us from Ontario. I'd like to welcome you both. And Jason Unruhe, let me start with you. The most recent piece of news, North Korea missile tests obviously have risen tensions in the region, especially, of course, where South Korea is concerned. But now the U.S. UN ambassador is saying that all options are on the table for Washington in dealing with North Korea's nuclear and missile tests. Tell us tell us your reaction first to that, and also what road this is going down in terms of the North Korean, I guess, goals behind this and the way that China is going to come into the picture.
Well, North Korea has always been a very strong supporter of their own right to self-determination, that they have the right to do with their resources or run their country how they feel they should. This condemnation of North Korea's recent tests is a sign of, in a manner of speaking, desperation by U.S. foreign policy. The DPRK has now advanced its own weapons technology to a point where if they were invaded, they could produce a significant amount of damage. The mutual assured destruction that largely existed between the United States and the Soviet Union. The DPRK wants to make it very clear that if they are going to be invaded and destroyed, then they are going to take the enemy with them, because they can't really win a traditional ground kind of war, but they have a right to self-determination. This is largely a huge measure of deterrent against invasion, and the UN condemnation is a reaction to that. It's now too late to actually get nuclear weapons out of the hands of the DPRK, because now they've been developed, they're there, they can be used. And that complicates matters for U.S. imperialism as it relates to trying to wield its influence over the DPRK.
Well, Lawrence Korb, first let me get a reaction from you regarding what the UN ambassador from the U.S. has said, and that all options are on the table for Washington now in dealing with North Korea's nuclear missile tests. Is this going down a path where there's going to be some action from the U.S. that you foresee based on this statement?
No, I think basically what our UN ambassador is saying, and this is no change in policy, that are all options. In other words, if North Korea were to use a nuclear weapon against us or any of our allies there, that we would not be prevented from, doing anything that we needed to do. So I think she was trying to send a signal. And don't forget, North Korea is violating an agreement they made, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They signed it, so they're violating it. And it's not just the United States, it's the international community that is condemning them. China has stopped, buying their coal because they're not happy with what North Korea is doing anyway. And so each time, and we've had agreements going back 20 years where they've agreed not to do this, not to keep developing nuclear weapons, not to test ballistic missiles, and then after a couple of years, the international community finds that they've violated them. So I think, what our, UN ambassador was saying is all of her predecessors, all options are on the table. If you should think of using nuclear weapons, then basically you have to be prepared for anything that we might want to do in response, and that's the whole idea of deterrence. Because if you let the other side know that if they should use them, what it will mean for them, they won't use them to begin with.
Well, let's look at the reaction, Jason Unruhe, from China. China has said that it would intervene to suspend its nuclear and missile programs that North Korea has done. But they gave a precondition of sorts. They said that we will do that if the U.S. and South Korea suspend their military exercises.
Yes, China has a definite interest in here, which does, to a large part, go against that of the DPRK. China just wants a stable region where they can wield as much of their influence as they can. And it seems definitely to me that they are willing to try to influence or coerce the DPRK into restricting a lot of its defensive measures in order to gain that kind of stability. This is all about control of the oil in the region and who has the military power to protect it. China is just looking for the most amount of power it can grab up with the military, and having the THAAD missile there would certainly be a restriction on that. So I think you do see a case where the interests of China and the interests of the DPRK conflict, and China is willing to support itself before it's willing to support one of its allies.
Well, let's talk about the most recent visits that the U.S. Defense Secretary Mattis had to the region, Lawrence Korb. He visited Japan and South Korea, and at his first visit, he threatened war against China over these disputed islands. He did back down from that strong rhetoric later on. But isn't that kind of maybe a wrong message to send on his first trip to that extreme?
I think it
no,
definitely...
this is for Lawrence Korb. I'm
said,
sorry. Go ahead, Lawrence Korb.
General Mattis had two goals. One was to disavow President's campaign promise or campaign indications telling South Korea and Japan to develop their own nuclear weapons. And the islands he talked about are Japanese-controlled islands. They've been under the control of Japan for hundreds of years. And what he was saying is, if you, China, try and take those with military force, we have a treaty with Japan, we will come to their aid, because that's the last thing you want is to have a war between China and Japan. So again, it goes back to this idea of deterrence. If you do this, it's not just going to be Japan. The United States will stand by its ally, which I think makes the prospect of war less likely. And this idea that China has the whole South China Sea, no. Under international law, you can't you say you have a whole sea. You have it, to 20 miles off your coastline.
Well, why is it then that you can have the U.S. come and make statements, Jason Unruhe, regarding a military or militaristic approach when China doesn't really use that language? I mean, it's their own backyard.
Well, I mean, this is a game of politics. This is a battle over resources that exists in the region. One side is choosing to use a different kind of language than the other. It may sound more diplomatic coming from China, but essentially both sides remain the same. This is about oil, this is about hydrocarbons, and that's a great deal of not only political but economic influence in the world. China may be using more diplomatic language, but in the end, the threat of confrontation between both sides remains the same. However, having said that, it's most likely and in the interest of all parties to come to some kind of a mutual agreement about who has access to what resources, for the sheer desire to not have some kind of escalating conflict which causes untold damage, which wouldn't be really beneficial for anyone.
Well, maybe we should take a step back, Lawrence Korb, and really tell us, now that there's a new U.S. administration in with Trump at the helm, what exactly are they planning to do in the area? I mean, what's going to be different than what Obama was doing? Is it just continuation of that?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much a continuation. The United States our Navy has always been primarily focused on the Pacific, and basically we're not doing anything more provocative. When China proclaimed an air defense identification zone well beyond what other nations have, the United States did not, send its commercial planes in there. When China has developed some of these islands, which they claim are theirs, which have no legal status. In fact, the International Court ruled against China when they tried to take some of these islands. The United States has just sailed its ships in the area, but it hasn't fired at Chinese vessels or anything like that. It continues its patrols, which it's had for years, of flying in the area to ensure that they know what's happening. But we never violate Chinese airspace.
Well, one thing that has happened, though, Jason Unruhe, is that there has been now the deployment officially of the THAAD missile system. That has happened now under Trump. And just recently, there was also a deployment that was made from the U.S. In terms of one of their ships being deployed to the region. This was U.S. Navy's third fleet to the South China Sea to send a message. This area is becoming militarized. Is this, what does this entail, or what is the purpose now behind this ramping up of the military aspect of it?
Well, this is a good deal of saber rattling. Both sides want the resources there, and they're both willing to rattle the cage of the other in order to get it. The U.S. has violated Chinese airspace. I recall in the early 2000s when a U.S. spy drone was shot down over China. Again, this is even a very minor incident. Both sides do carry out violations of each other. That's just how international politics is done. The legal question over the islands is certainly an interesting one that I don't think is fully settled yet. But this increasing militarization does pose a threat to the region, and both sides are jockeying for control of the resources. And both of them seemingly are willing to escalate the militarization of the zone towards those ends.
Well, if we were to take a look, Lawrence Korb, from the time that the pivot to Asia happened and up till now, I think it was a gift, in a sense, on a side note, about the TPP not going into effect to China, because that, in essence, may have rattled some of the countries. But were you to break down the countries in this region, Lawrence Korb, do you think that in terms of a ratio with the support, does it go to the U.S. or to China? If you were to break it down, what percentage would you give it?
No, I think the majority of the countries leaning toward the U.S. In fact, they're the ones who asked the U.S. to get more involved. For example, Vietnam, the Philippines, that was before they got their new president. They asked us to come back. We had left the Philippine islands after the end of the Cold War. The Australians want us. Most of the countries there want us to prevent China from becoming an expansionist power. And the great irony is the TPP, all of the countries in the region wanted it. It would have been bad for China. But President Trump decided not to do it, and Secretary Clinton in the campaign said she wouldn't do it. She didn't think the deal was good for the United States. But in effect, that was a win for China, because now China will get trade agreements with a lot of those countries. And it's not just the United States that takes military action. The Vietnamese have, sent ships out into the area when China has gotten some of the islands that are what they see as in their territorial waters.
Do you agree with that, Jason Unruhe, that most of the countries in that part of the world are for or behind the U.S. or support the U.S. as opposed to China?
I would definitely agree with that statement. If you're talking by sheer numbers of countries on the side of the U.S., I would definitely say so. These are countries that have been under the heel of U.S. imperialism for some time. These are countries that are doing the bidding of the United States. To simply say that they want them, they are calling the U.S. in, is rather half truth. The U.S. wants themselves in there in order to combat Chinese influence. But to answer the question, do the majority of the countries in the region do prefer the U.S. over China? I would have to say that is correct.
Well, what about what some countries are saying behind the scenes, Lawrence Korb? For example, Japan behind the scenes, senior officials are worried about the fact that for example, when it comes to Trump, that it could ultimately, for example, act against North Korea, and then that would leave them to face the retaliation because it's happening in their part of the world. And then when it comes to issues of trade, well, they still do conduct a lot of trade with China, these countries in the region. So it's not like they really, on the face of it, maybe portray themselves in one way, but when it comes to China, they're still dealing with China, at least in a trade level.
We conduct an awful lot of trade with China. In fact, China, I think, is the largest importer of anything or close to Mexico. No, we do a lot of trade with China, and that's the paradox here. They get along on one level, and others they don't. Like the United States and China both agree we don't want North Korea to have nuclear weapons. The real question is, how do we go about making that happen? You mentioned the deployment of the THAAD missile. We basically, Obama started it and said, if North Korea continues to do this, we'll deploy it. And what Trump has done is he put the beginning of it in there. Now, if the Chinese don't like it, which they say could also undermine their nuclear deterrent, it's up to them to tell the North Koreans, knock off this stuff, because basically it's impacting our interest as well, because of the fact that if this system is there to stop your missiles, it could have an impact on ours. So I think that's what you're going to have to work this thing out diplomatically, and there's no military solution. It was up to me. I'd sign the armistice. I mean, I would end the war. The war it was an armistice. We didn't stop the war. Recognize North Korea in return for them agreeing to abide by the treaty which they signed, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and then we could begin to move on. The problem in North Korea is you have an erratic leader. I mean, you just don't know what he is going to be doing next. I mean, he just murdered his brother, he's murdered his uncle, and the people in the country are starving. So, this is a great paradox here, that we got to have some rational person that we can deal with.
Many questions are lying right now, Jason Unruhe, regarding the way that China is going to deal with North Korea, because over this fact that Lawrence Korb mentioned about the half-brother, it seemed like North Korea told China to stay out of its business. Is there some kind of division between North Korea and China that is just surfacing now, or is it just over this incident, or does it have to relate to other things?
Oh no, there's always been a divide between China and the DPRK. China is more interested in stability in the region in order to do business. For example, Chinese companies have a great deal of interest in special economic zones that exist within the DPRK, and rising hostilities makes those more difficult to deal with and can harm profits. But neither China nor the United States has any right to tell the DPRK what kind of measures it should have to defend itself. Being such a small third world country, it should, by all rights, have whatever means necessary to defend itself from any kind of foreign aggression. As you said, the war is still on. There are still attacks against the country, not necessarily militarily, but there are also sanctions and whatnot, which force the DPRK to sign certain agreements under duress. They don't have any other choice. They're forced into a lot of these situations. But there is definitely a divide between the two. China would much prefer the DPRK just to be a compliant client state, to just do whatever they tell them to do, because they really don't want a U.S. ally, a U.S. ally right on the border with them. But the DPRK is resistant to becoming anybody's client state and wishes to, in fact, boldly state and defend their own independence.
Okay. One last question to Lawrence Korb, 30 seconds actually, and another one to Unruhe. Lawrence Korb, a lot of people are actually thinking about the pivot Asia up to now and where it's going to go to the future, with the future looking like a war that's going to be a showdown between China and U.S. in that region. Is that something that you see possible?
Well, anything is possible, but I don't think it's going to happen. And the pivot to Asia basically meant that we're spending more money on the Navy than the Army. It hasn't changed that much. There's a couple of more ships. So the whole thing was to try and send a signal to the American people, we're going to stop being bogged down in the Middle East and our future is in the Pacific. But obviously it hasn't worked that way because we're still bogged down in the Middle East.
Okay, we're going to unfortunately have to leave it there. I do apologize, Unruhe, we can't ask you that last question. But let me thank you. Jason Unruhe, independent media personality and political commentator, spoke to us there from Ontario. And also thank you, Lawrence Korb, U.S. foreign policy and national security analyst, who spoke to us from Washington. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From the Commentator entire team in the capital, Taiwan, it's goodbye.